There we are. So I'm going to do a Rails project today with as little magic as possible. It will be fairly similar to what you would build if you followed the Getting Started with Rails guide. So if you went to guides.rubyonrails.org, there is the Getting Started with Rails section. And the app that you build there is a simple blog, and it actually it ends up being more complicated than what I'm going to be building today. It's recommended that you work your way through this tutorial before you start your project, just so that in that way you will have two different sort of from the ground up Rails applications under your belt, the one that we're working on today and the one that is in this guide, both of which do not rely on scaffolding, so you build all the components yourself. Okay, so what I'm going to begin with is I'm going to go to the folder where I wish to create my application. And I will bring up a command prompt. And in fact, I will bring up multiple command prompts. I often have 2 or 3 command prompts running, one for the server, run for a Rails console, which gives me sort of an interactive Ruby prompt where I have access to my active record models, and then one for just typing in Rails commands or Git commands, because I'm also going to be using Git today. And so I will begin by starting a new Rails application, so Rails new, and I'll call it without magic, hopefully, and we'll hit enter. And that creates our Rails application. So it creates the sort of the file folder structure, puts a bunch of files into place for us. The name of the project will be the name of the folder that is created. At the end of that process, bundler is brought into play, where it sort of makes sure we have the latest version of all the gems that are required. And then I just need to navigate in both of my command prompt windows to that new folder. So that was magicless, or no, what was it? Without magic. And I will navigate to that with both. So I also want this to be a Git repository, so I can type Git in it, and because I'm in the folder that I wish the repository to be, I can just type Git in it and then dot, referring to this folder. And I've now initialized this folder as a Git repository. If I look into the folder itself, I can know that it is Git enabled because there is this hidden .git folder present. And that's where all the history goes. And because we already have folders and files in here, it's time to do our first Git commit. So remembering that there's a 2-step process for commits, I first need to stage the new files. So I say git add, and I just want to recursively add all files from this folder onwards. So just git add dot. I get warnings that have to do with line feeds. You may or may not get those warnings. And running git status shows us all the files that are now queued up to be added to this Git repository. And I can now commit them with a message. Initial commit of a new Rails app. For now, I won't bother connecting this Git repository to a remote on GitHub. I'll do that after class, and then I'll make the repository available to you. For now, I'll just make all those changes locally. So I'll just do sort of commits locally, and I can push them all to the remote after class. So the next thing we can do is with one of these 2 command prompts, I can fire up the Rails server. So that's just Rails S for server. And that will bring up our server on localhost 3000. And we can head over to a browser to make sure everything's working. So I can go over here. And it looks like we're good to go because we get the yay, you're on Rails message. We're going to remove this message in a moment's time. So we're going to put in our own controller and have the root of our domain route to the controller that we're going to add. Another thing I want to show you today is just making use of Git branches, so that one of the things that students tend to run into when first working with Rails is doing something unintended to their project that they can't easily undo even if they're using version control. And branches are a nice solution to give you sort of a space to do some work that can be easily removed at any time. So a branch does just that. If you think of a Git sort of version history as a tree, you start with sort of a root and you start to add to that root, and you can branch from the root, make changes, and you can always switch back to the main sort of the main trunk of the tree, and everything that you did in that branch will be gone. And so it gives you a place where you can play around or try to implement new features without feeling like you could permanently damage your existing application. So I'm going to create a branch right now. Because what I want to do is I want to add a new model to my application, and I want a branch in which to do that. So I will say git checkout -b. Checkout is how we switch between branches. With a -b, it means I'm about to create a new branch. And here I will say creating student model, because that's what I want to do in this branch. I want an application where the first model I create is going to represent a student, and so this branch is going to be where I create that model. So git checkout -b, and then the name of the branch, trying to be as descriptive as possible, and we are now automatically, it tells us we have switched to that new branch. If I type git branch, I can see the branches that exist in my project, and I can see the one that I am currently using, which is the one with the asterisk beside it and it's highlighted. You can see there's also the master branch. So I'm in this creating student model branch. Now I want to go and create that student model, so I'm going to run the Rails generate command. I'm not going to generate a scaffold like we've done in the past. I'm just going to generate the model all on its own, and the model is going to be called student. And to begin with, I'm only going to give the student a single property, which is their name, and that will be a string, which will translate to a varchar in the database side of things. So this creates a few files for me, some testing files for unit testing of this model, the model itself, which is in the app models folder, and the migration, which describes the creation of this table. Another file that we can look at that we haven't seen yet doesn't yet exist. There's going to be in the DB folder a schema file, which is a Ruby description of your database. And so to run this migration, the one that's going to create my students, I can say Rails DB migrate. That will run all pending migrations. There's only one of them. It is this one right here, the create student migration. Now that I have executed that, I have this Schema RB file in my DB folder, and if I open it in Atom, it gives me some warnings about this file being auto-generated. So it wants to warn you that you can't simply just change this file to affect your database. Every change you want to make to your database should be done by way of a migration, and each migration that you run, that's what affects this file. And the way we can read it is, you can see for each of the tables that exist, there is a create table section, and it lists the different columns that exist on that table. The only column that's ever not mentioned is the primary key column. There's always an ID column for every single table, and that's just an assumption that is made. So here we can see that we have a students table, It's pluralized, so when we created our model, we asked for a model for a student, singular, and when we created the table, it's like, well, you're gonna put multiple students in this table, so the table will be called students. We asked for a name, which was a string, and we got automatically the created at and updated at date times that Rails will manage for us. Back at my command prompt, I'm going to make use of git to look at the status. I can see all the new files that have been brought into play by way of creating this student, and I can add them to my repository by staging all files and committing created the student model and migrated the students table. If I run git status, it tells me I'm still on my creating student branch and there's nothing to commit. I've just committed the most recent changes. If I go and remember that I have two different branches, I'm working in this create student model branch. It's the branch that has a schema.rb file. It's the branch that has in the app models folder a student model. If I check out the master branch, so if I run git branch now, we'll see that I'm on master. We can see that in my models folder, the student model is gone. In my DB folder, the schema file is gone. So that's what I meant by having these sort of isolated workspaces. I can switch right back to the creating student model branch. Git supports autocomplete, so I just had to start typing CR and that'll switch over to it. And my schema file is back and my model's back. And so if we had messed that up seriously, we could just go to check out our master and start again. We could just delete that branch and start again. What we actually want to do is we want to merge those changes back into our master. And so I can say git merge the creating student model. So I'm on the master. That is the one that has no schema yet, no student model. But
sorry,
yes.
You have to be in the model, sorry, the master branch to merge?
Yes, yeah. There are ways to pass command line arguments to specify like the from and the where, but it's just simpler just to do this. So we're in the master, we're merging in this particular branch. A git status tells us that there's nothing to commit, but if we look at the DB folder, that schema file is there, and the app models folder, the student model is there. So that's good. That's just an example of how to use branches. For the remainder of the work I'm going to do today, I'm not going to use that branching model, but if I was working on a large Rails application, I would probably create an individual branch for every single feature that I add and just be very diligent about rolling them and merging them back into master and then deleting those branches as I go. Your branches by default don't get pushed to a remote, so if you're working and pushing to a remote repository, you either have to explicitly push your branch or just be fine with the fact that you're only ever pushing your master, and then when you merge your branch into your master, that's the time when, if you pushed it up to the remote, that's when those changes will be pushed. Okay, so we now have a student model. If I was to run my Rails console, that would bring me into an interactive Ruby prompt where I have access to this new model. And so I could check out what a student looks like by saying student.new, and I can see that this is a student object. It has an ID, a name, created at, and updated at. And just to give us something to work with, I can go and create a few students. So I can create a student with the name Wally Glutton. We can see that performs the insert into the students table. Student.count now shows a count of 1, and I can do a student.create name Daisy Glutton. and the count is now 2. So I just do this to give us some data to work with from the web application side of things, because at this point we don't have any of the things that scaffolding would have given us, like a form to create new students. So we use the console to do that. We can always leave the console open, but it's like a snapshot of your project in time. So if you start to make changes to your application, those changes aren't reflected in the console unless you type reload with an exclamation mark. And so I can show you that in action if I go and open up my student model and add a validation. Validates name with a presence of true. And I go back to my console and I try to create a student without a name. It let me do so. My validation was not pulled in. If I reload my application and I now try to create a student, I'm blocked from doing so. So you just have to remember that if you have a console window always open and you're making changes to your models, just make sure you do that reload exclamation mark so that those changes get reloaded. I'm going to now remove that blank student, so I can say student last destroy, and now student.all should show me my 2 students without the blank one in there. So that was this right here. Take the last student and destroy it. That was the blank one. I'll leave my console for now. I've made a change to my student, so I can commit that change. So I can add my file, and I can commit the fact that I added a name, presence, validation to the student model. Some students prefer to use Git in GUI format, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just find that because Rails itself is very command line oriented, it makes more sense for me just to do both Git and Rails at the command line, because switching back and forth between the command line and a GUI Git application, I just find that to be a little clumsy. This sort of shows my bias for the command line. So like I grew up as a programmer at the command line, and so I'm very comfortable at it. And I imagine that not all of you came to development in that way. So you might not be as comfortable at the command line, but if you're going to be working with sort of modern web technologies, most of them are very command line focused. And so it's just something that you will want to deal with and just get more comfortable with it, especially in sort of the safe environment of a classroom. You can make mistakes and learn the command line. Okay, so we now have a model that has some validations on it, but our web application in and of itself doesn't really have anything going for it. We have the Welcome to Rails page, but what I would like is at least 2 views, and I need to hang those views on something. I need a controller to have more than 1 view or to have any views. And so I'm going to create a students controller, and I want it to have an IndexAction/view where I can show all existing students, and I want it to have a show view where I can show individual students. And so again, there's sort of this distinction between different types of actions, some that are member actions like the show. It's going to require an ID, which student to show, and then there will be some that are like collections, and that'll be like the index, because it's going to show the collection of all students. So to create a controller, I'm back at my command prompt and I'm Rails generating a controller, and the controller is students. And I know off the hop that I want 2 particular actions and views, so I can name them at the command prompt. If I just ran the controller students, that would be fine. I would get a blank controller and no views, but I already know off the hop that I want those 2 views, so I will create them. Okay, so you can see a few things were created. I now have a students controller. My routes were added. There's a few new routes that we're gonna have to edit in order to work well with the student controller. There was a few views created, a student subfolder in the views folder, which has an index and a show view, and then some testing and CSS and JavaScript files associated with these students. I can git add it, git commit, added a new student controller. And remember, anytime I want to see sort of like a logbook of all the things that I've done in my project, if I've been committing properly small little segments over time and naming each one of those segments with a good commit message, my git log gives me a nice little history of exactly what's been going on in my project. So you can see the initial commit of a new Rails app, created the student model, added a validation, added the new student controller. This can be really handy at work where you have to fill out, some work will have you fill out timesheets, right? Where you have to account for the times that you have been working. And if you're anything like me, you might forget to fill out your timesheets until the end of a 2-week period, at which point you're going to have to fill out all 2 weeks worth of timesheets. Having a really detailed Git log can be super helpful for that, because you can just look at your Git log and know exactly what you were working on at any point of the day, and you can then retroactively fill in the timesheets that you should have been filling out all along because you have Git. So it's helpful in that way. So I have this controller. I'm going to do a little bit of setup work with Atom. So if you're not working with Atom, this won't apply to you. But if I hit Control / I get my project, and I'm going to remove. I had earlier dragged in the schema file, so it defaulted to my project folder being my DB folder, and I don't want that. So I'm going to remove that as the project folder. And I'm going to add the project that I'm working on, which is this without magic. I'm going to select that. And it didn't do anything. There it is. This gives me the benefit of two things. I have a nice little tree view on the left-hand side that I can show and hide with Control /. So now if I want to navigate to files, I don't always have to resort to opening up a Windows Explorer and navigating around there. I get a little expandable, collapsible tree view that I can go and pull things out like my student controller. And for example, my routing file, which is going to be in this config folder. But the other really nice thing that having your project folder defined gives you is you get a fuzzy finder. And a fuzzy finder lets you pull up files without having to worry about where they're pathed, as long as you know the names of the files. And so if I hit Control P and I start typing in the thing that I want, so I want the student controller. And so I can say stu, and I can start typing it. It gives me some matches. And I know what's the controller I want. I don't even have to finish typing in the word student. I could just start typing in controller, and it finds student controller for me. And I just hit enter, and there it is. So when you're working with Rails that has this big folder structure, lots of different files, you're going to be opening up lots of different tabs. Having a fuzzy finder at your disposal is, I would say, crucial. And it just really, really helps just the navigation. You're not digging through files and folders, you're just typing the name. You can type pieces of the name. It's just a really nice way of pulling up the files that you need. So I can do the same thing for the routing file, Control P, and I can say I want my routing file.
Where would that be located?
Oh, and sorry, if you're not using the fuzzy finder, the locations of these files are in the AppControllers folder is where my students controller is, and the routes file is in the config folder called routes.rb. So by default, Rails gave us 2 routes. And the way we are going to be naming routes is, say routes. We can name routes with the resources command, which will create all of our routes automatically for us, but we're trying to do things without magic today. And so To create routes, we're going to use our various HTTP verbs. That'll be the first part of the route. Then the URL path that we want to path to. Just that alone will give us a particular style of route. When you just have the verb and the URL path, the first part of the path refers to the controller, and the second part of the path refers to the controller's action. So if I wanted to load up my student's index file, I could go to my localhost students/index, and I would see the view that was automatically created for me for the student index, and there's also a similar one for show. That's not necessarily what I want though. I'd like to be able to see my index when I go to just plain old /students. And to show a particular student, I'd like to go to some student / their primary key. So I want to change these routes to reflect that. And so the way we do that is we can add to this naming of, so this naming convention for the verb. This is the HTTP verb. So if you remember, we have a variety of HTTP verbs. We have like get and post and put and patch and delete. Today we're going to focus on a few of those, but initially we're just going to start with get, because when we want to get all of our students, that's just going to be a simple get request, and when we want to show an individual student, that's also going to be a get request. We already have the verbs in place. These are going to be our show routes. And I said for the index, I just want it to be /students. And for the show an individual student, I want it to be /student/some ID. We can then have the hash rocket symbol, which is like the key value pair operator in Ruby. And we can specify a particular controller by name and a particular action. And so here I'm going to say that I want the get request to /students to open up or to run the students index action. And I want the URL /students/some ID, I want that to route to the students show action. So now the word routing might make a little bit more sense in the context of what we're doing in this file, is we are routing URLs to particular controller actions. And yes, we could have auto-magically got these routes. So I could have auto-magically got these routes by saying resource students, or is it resources? And then I could have said, but only the index and the show. And that would have got me the same thing. But we're working without magic, so we will work without magic. I'm going to add a few more things here. I'm going to give these, or at least one of these routes, a name that I can then use from my views when I build links. And so this will only become apparent when I start working with my views. But I'm going to say as, and I'm going to name this route student. I will eventually name this route students. And I want to do one other thing with the students route, is I want to put a constraint on the parameter ID. But before I do that, let's just make sure that these routes are working. So I should be able to go to /students to see that index view, and to /students/some ID to see the show view. So back over here, /students runs the index. That's all well and good. And /students/some ID goes to the show. Somewhat problematically though, I can go to /students/wat, and that takes me to the show. Wat is not a number. I want only numbers to be supported here. And so I can add a constraint here to specify that the ID, which is present in the URL, I can match it to a regular expression, specifically one or more digit. So /D stands for the digits 0 through 9, and the plus sign means one or more. So I've just built a regular expression, and the slashes on either side is just Ruby's way, and that's the same as in a lot of languages of saying this thing is a regular expression. So the regular expression is what sits in between the forward slashes, and this is our definition for a single one or more digit. And so this is the student index, as in show all students, and this is the student show a student. And we get this handy little comment that came with the routing file that tells us that if we want more information on routing, there's a guide on that. I'll just erase that for now. Now that I've added this constraint, I should be able to see it in action. So I should be able to go over here, and my numeric ID should still pull up the show, but a non-numeric ID doesn't match to anything. I get a routing error, which wow, the giants are here. In a production app, that would be a 404 error. And so you would see a 404 message automatically displayed. In development mode, it's just a routing error. You get to see your routes. Sometimes what I will do is if I want to look at my routing, I'll just put in a non-existent route into the URL, just so I can take a look at what my routes are, because they're displayed here. Here's the student's path. Well, that's nice. It actually, so Rails is still doing a little bit of magic for us. Notice that we didn't give this route a name using the as property, but it has been named student's path for us. But we did give this one a name, so we have a student path. This is the path itself, this is the controller and the action, and the same thing goes for the student. You can even see the extra constraint on the ID that's being placed right there. All right, so I can go back to my command prompt and I can add the fact that I have wired up the index and show routes. And so there's a few other files that are going to come into play right now. One of them is going to be the controller. When I created this controller, I specified that I was going to have a index and show action, and they're already there. And what happens at the end of any given action is that Rails is going to automatically load the students/index.html.erb file, more specifically the app views students. And at the end of the show action, this is going to load up the app view students show.html.erb. So these actions become staging areas for the data that we want to make available inside of our views. So we have two views, the index view and the show view. What we want to stage in terms of data for the index view is a collection of all the students. And what we want to stage in terms of data for the show view is an individual student, specified by the ID that came to us by way of the URL. So I'll start with the index action, and I'm going to open up that index view as well. So I will navigate to my app views students folder, and there's that index.html.erb. This is why when we load up the index action, we see a header that says student index and this message that says find me in. That is what we see when we go to this. So that view was created for us automatically when we created our controller and when we specified the views that we wanted. Okay, so I will say, change this to an H2. I'll say all students. And what I'd like to do here is I'd like to be able to loop through a collection of students. So I'll make an assumption. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Which file are we editing right now?
We are in the app views students index.html.erb file. And so I'm going to assume that I have the data that I want to work with before I actually have it. I'm going to assume that I have a collection of students that I can loop through with an each. And I can say for each of those students, name each one in turn student. And inside of the block, I can type out the HTML that should go along with each one of these student objects. So I'll have a class of student on a div. And inside of there, I might have a name inside of a strong tag within a P where I echo out the student's name. So this student from our collection is an active record object. And so if we remember back to our work with active record, for each of the properties or each of the columns on our students table, we can just do dot the name of that column. So I want the student's name, I just say student dot name. Then I'll close my paragraph tag. So with the assumption that I can get access to a collection of students, I can now loop over that collection, name each student student in turn, build a div, within that div build a paragraph tag, within that paragraph tag output the word name in bold and then the actual student's name. If I tried to just run this now, like if I went to my browser and I just tried to run that, I'm going to get an error, and it's going to be undefined method each for nil class nil because I'm trying to call each on something that does not exist. That thing is nil right now, the @students variable. To fix this, I can go back to where we can actually create variables. Now I could have cheated, right? I could go to student.all there. And that would do the right thing, right? I can go over to my controller and I can see there's my two students. But in the world of MVC, there's supposed to be sort of a hard line separation between your M and your V. It should maybe even be called MCV to, like, you know, in the acronym to sort of show that separation. The model and the view should never be aware of each other. You shouldn't be directly calling the model within the view. And so it's students. Your views should not know or care about where their data is coming from. And that just makes your code more flexible. Maybe your data is going to eventually come from something that isn't an active record model. Over in the controller, this is where I can load up that data, because at the end of the index action, this is when that view is loaded. And the index action is my opportunity to load up data for that view. And anything I create as an instance variable inside of here is going to be automatically available inside of the view. And so there is where I can call student.all. I could also do things like ordering by name if I wanted to. And now we'll load up all of the students. We will then load up the index, and this students variable will be available to us. And so over here we should see all of the students, but now it should be ordered by name, so Daisy should come before Wally. And she does. And if I view source, we can see that for each one of the students, we got not just the name, but that HTML that we had configured multiple times. One div of class student for each of the students that contained a paragraph that contained the bolded name and the individual student name. And so that came to us by way of our view, this part here. So this is one of the many places where Rails decides to break object orientation in a very purposeful way. At variables inside of a class are in plain old Ruby objects. Those are instance variables and they are private. In Rails, however, the instance variables we create within our actions, and an action is just another name for a method in a application controller class, those get automatically shared with our views. So it is like our views share scope with the controller models that they are bound to. And so you just have to sort of think a little bit outside the object-oriented paradigm to realize that this, which would ordinarily be a private instance variable, is automatically accessible inside of the view. How are things sitting so far? I've tried to remove as much magic as possible. I think I'm almost at zero magic. I mean, there's a few things that are sort of happening automatically, but not really automagically. So let's continue on. Let's see if we can pull up what's required to show an individual student. So we now have this list of students. I'd like to be able to show an individual student by going to /students/SumID. I have two students in my database. I will have one with an ID of 1 and the other with an ID of 2. Wally was the first one that I created, so by going to /student/1, I would like to see Wally's information on this page. I'm now going to pull up that view because I'm going to be working with the show controller action, and so I need to open up the AppViewStudents show. Here it is. Up at the top, I will change that H1 to an H2 and just have it say student information. There's not a lot of information right now. Students just have a single name, but that's fine, right? That's all we have for them. We can modify this as we will. And I can now copy and paste what it is to be a student in HTML from this other file. So I can grab these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different lines, and I can put them in here. Again, just sort of imagining I have the data that I wish to have. And instead of just referencing a student variable, I'm going to represent an @student, because that's data that I can now queue up inside of the show student controller action, make it available to this view. Again, if I try to load this view up right now, I would get an error because that is a nil variable. And at this point, like the Rails programmer in me would have sort of the gut feeling that I am not being dry. I am repeating myself, right? I have the same approximate HTML and ERB in two places. Not going to worry about that just yet, but this is going to lead the way to creating a partial, which is like a method for ERB, which will remove that repetition. But before we do that, let's actually get this show all wired up from the controller. Here I want to show a student. So in my show view, I've assumed a @student variable. So I will make that variable inside of the show action. The show action is what then loads up the show view, and all of its instance variables are accessible inside of the view. And initially, I will just find and I will hard code in an ID. So now every time I go to show, regardless of what the parameter is in the URL, regardless of what the ID parameter is in the URL, I'm always going to see the student with an ID of 1. So let's go and look at that. There's Wally Glutton. Doesn't matter if I change between them, because I've just hard coded in always load up student 1. That's not what I want though. I want to get this ID from the URL, which is guaranteed by way of my regular expression to be a number. That's what I want in here. And if we were working in PHP, we would go to our get superglobal and we would get that parameter. In Rails, we have the equivalent of the get and the post superglobals in one called params. And we just key into it. It's a hash, so we just key into it at position ID. And so that is the parameter that's coming to us by way of the URL. And so we're asking it to find the particular student that has been mentioned by ID in the URL. So whereas this was load all students ordered by name, this is load student mentioned by ID in the route. And as long as the ID that I'm mentioning in my URL actually exists in the database, so as long as there is a primary key that matches that parameter, things will work and it'll load up. So I should now be able to go back to here. Student/2 should go to Daisy. Student/1 should go to Wally. And student/99 will throw an exception. Record not found, which will result in a 404 error in production mode. Did you have a comment?
First one, it would be ideal to have it handle the exception by rewriting to it.
And it does. It does. In production mode, it will automatically redirect to the 404 page that you have defined. In development mode, it drops you down to this debugging screen and actually drops you at an ERB prompt where we can like interactively type Ruby and sort of find out why we didn't have a student. And this is super cool. Like this is a live via the web access to your application where you can type in Ruby code. It's the same as running Rails console, but live in your browser, which is a sort of an amazing thing for debugging purposes. Back over here, I'm good. So I can go to /students, see all my students, and I can go to any one student and see that one student. I've done enough work where I should probably have committed twice in this process, but I can commit once for that. So I can commit here and say, we now have a working index and show action with associated views. So we now have this working index and show where we can navigate by way of URL to the index or the show. It would be nice to be able to actually link to those things. So it would be nice to be able to, when I'm at an individual student, click a link to take me back to all the students rather than having to manually type that in. And it would also be nice to perhaps like click on a student's name to go to that student's show page. And so to do that, we need to build some links and we need to make use of the names of our routes. And so if I do my trick of just putting in a route that doesn't exist, I can see I have two named routes. one which is called students path, and one which is called student path. And that sort of makes sense, right? The students path is going to take us to the student's index action, and the student is going to show an individual student. So let's go and edit our views. In the show view, it would be nice to have a paragraph down below where I can have a link to back to students. And I could just manually do all this work. I can make a link with an href attribute and have it go to /students, and I can put the text in, and that'll work. So it's just your plain old A with an href attribute. And I can go over here, and I can go to an individual student, and I can click on that link, and I can go back. But that's not the Rails way of doing things, because routing actually gives us the ability to change our routes. Like I might want to be able to go in later and maybe call students something else, or maybe have the path involve more. Like maybe it's a specific type of student, like a cooking student or something. If I was to go and change my route like this, now cooking students would work, but if I tried to get back following my link, it breaks. And so manually creating links to different parts of our application is going to be something that we try to avoid. And instead, we have a handy little helper that lets us build these things. And so I can use an ERB echo. So remember, that's the ERB tag, the less than % with the equal sign. It's the link to helper that I'm going to be using. What am I linking to? Well, the text of what I'm linking to is back to students, or maybe back to all students. And where do I want to link to specifically? I want to link to the students path. And so this will create for me an A with an href going to the correct location. But if I change the routing scheme, change how my routes are named, this is not going to break. It'll just automatically go to the right thing, because I'm calling it by name students path rather than baking in the URL into the link. So if I go back here to an individual student and I click back to all students, you can see down below at the bottom of the screen it's going to /students, and it works. If I again go to my routing file and I change this to cooking students, leaving this one alone, on this page here, what broke? Oh, now it's going to be called cooking students path. So it's not going to be that helpful in that I didn't give it an as. So it actually did break there. I would actually have to give it an as so that it would be generic enough to know that it was as students. And now it would properly path to the cooking students path. I'll remove that as though. I don't need that because I'm not explicitly changing this. So you can see, even though I've been trying to avoid magic, there is still some sort of convention-based magic coming into play. So that's something that'll take me from a student back. What if I want to link to individual students from the index page? So if I'd like to be able to make this name a link to the individual student, I can do just that. I can say link to. The text from my link is going to be the student's name. So I can leave that as the first parameter. The second parameter is the named route. The route is called student path, student singular. But I can't just do that. And the reason I can't just specify the student path is because I need to specify which student I actually want to path to. And so that student path takes a parameter of the student. And so I'm routing to the student path. Which student? This student, the student that's in this student variable. And now I can go to the index view. Each one of my students, that's my cooking student path still. Each one of my students still has a link attached to it. You can see down in the left-hand corner, it links to the proper student. I can click on either one of those links and it takes me to the correct student, and I can click back. I will now give you an example of sort of where some of the magic in Rails starts to creep in. This pattern is so common, this pattern of pathing to some particular named route for an individual object and then passing that object, that Rails will just allow me just to pass the object itself. So I can say link to student.name. What do I want to link to? Student. So that's a little bit of magic. And that's going to do the exact same thing. So if I go back here, it still works. I'll leave the unmagic version in place because that's the point of today. Student path, student is the unmagical version. One of the things I was thinking about in the context of this course and in the context of the magic of Rails specifically in this course is that this course is not supposed to necessarily be a course on Rails. It's supposed to be a course on full stack web development, and Rails is supposed to be just the way that we are investigating what a full stack framework looks like. So learning all of the magic of Rails will help you if you're going to be a Rails developer, if you're going to do Rails development forever. But you probably all won't be Rails developers. Maybe some of you will be, but not all of you definitely will be. And so we don't necessarily have to learn this magic to understand how full stack web development works. And so that's why I think going forward, I'll try to, I'll mention magic here and there, but I'll try to avoid it as much as possible because I think it'll just get in the way of what I'm really trying to teach, is like what is involved in working with a large web-based framework like Rails, but without having to sort of think of yourself as, okay, I need to know all this stuff because I'm going to be a Rails developer. Because especially in the Winnipeg job market, Rails is not a really big thing. I was Skyping with a former student last night though, who is now working out in Vancouver, where Rails developers are incredibly highly sought after. And so he moved out to Vancouver just thinking I'll get a job when I get out there, and he immediately got a job as a Rails developer. Apparently the hot technologies in Vancouver right now are Rails on the back-end side of things and React on the front side of things. And so if you're thinking of moving out west, those are some technologies that are very, very much in demand in that space.
So that link to, that's Ruby, right?
Yes, that is, that's Ruby, but it's specifically like the link to method comes to us from Rails.
And if you want to use JavaScript on that file,
On what specifically?
there on your view.
Like within the view? There are places to put our JavaScripts. So if we want to add JavaScript to our application, we put our JavaScript in the JavaScript folder, and then we bind it to particular elements within our DOM by way of classes and IDs. So we wouldn't like hard coding JavaScript into any of the views. We would put it off into a separate file and have it sort of look for specific elements within pages by ID or class, and then modify those either by binding like event handlers to them or by modifying them by way of the DOM. Okay, so I've got the links working. I can go back over to Git and commit that change. Navigation links between the show and index views. Now I said earlier on that I sort of felt a little bit bothered by this repetition. This fact that a student was represented in HTML in two places in a nearly identical manner. The only difference between the two representations was in one I have this link to, and in the other I don't. And in one I have a reference to an @student, whereas in the other I'm just referencing a student. We can collapse those things together. For the sake of simplicity, I'll leave the link inside of both of them. So even when we're on the show page, the link will still be there. Let's go about creating a partial to collapse this repetition. So we're gonna follow the don't repeat yourself or dry methodology. One thing that students take to heart maybe a little too much is dry is a good motto for both your views and your programming code, but it can be taken too far. So if you find yourself trying to remove all repetition from your views and all repetition from your source code, but it's making your code harder to follow or making it sort of incredibly sort of roundabout, don't bother, right? So we're not trying to remove repetition just because repetition in and of itself is bad. We're trying to remove repetition if it's going to help us better understand our code, and it's going to help us make our code more maintainable in the long run. And so I see a lot of students, like especially when they're just plain out coding, try to remove repetition in every possible place by extracting things out to functions and whatnot. And that's only worthwhile if you've really thought about the abstraction that you're actually abstracting out. If you're just abstracting code out for the sake of it, you're probably doing it wrong. And there's sort of a saying in programming that premature optimization is the root of all evil. Take that to heart. Don't try to optimize things just for the sake of it when you could be sacrificing readability or maintainability. In this case, though, you could see that we could potentially, every time we want to change how a student is displayed, so eventually we're going to add more properties to a student. A student might have more than just a name. They might have an email address and an image and lots of other properties. And right now, as it stands, anytime we add a new property, we would have to modify the show view and the index view. So for the sake of making this sort of representation of a student in HTML, for drawing that out, it seems to make sense to have that in one location. And so I will go to my app views folder, specifically the student subfolder, and I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it underscore student.html.erb. And although I'm trying to remove as much magic as possible, there still is some conventions we're going to want to follow. And one of them specifically is the naming of this partial. We should name it after the thing that we are trying to extract out. We're trying to extract out a single student model. And the model is capital S, but all of our views will be lowercase, so we're just going to call it underscore student. So named after the model, but underscored. Open that up inside of Atom, and to go over to my index, and these 5 lines here, I'm going to delete them from the index and paste them into the partial. I still have my div with the class of student. I still have my paragraph tag and my name, which is strong. And I still have a link to where I'm mentioning a student by name, and I'm linking to a student by way of the student path. The name of my variable, again, convention-wise, should match the name of my partial. So I'm just going to put some of that information in a comment up here. The name of the partial should match the model. And that's if we are creating a partial for a particular model. It's 2 dashes. So the name of the partial should match the model. So that's why we call this student. So with a prepended underscore, and the name of the variable we use within the partial should match the partial name. So So underscore student is the name of our partial. The variable we're using within it is called plain old student. Now that we have that, we can go to both the show and the index and remove the repetitive code. In the show, what I'm going to put in its place is a request inside of an ERB echo to render. What do I want to render? I want to render a partial. What is the name of the partial? The partial's name is student. What object do I want to make accessible to the partial with the name student? So inside of the partial, we have this variable called student. What object should that variable be? How do I pass in this data? Because it's almost like a method. So I'm going to pass in an object, and that object will be called or named after the partial itself. The object should be the @student object, because that's the object that we made available inside of the controller. So if I just hop to the controller for 1 second, that's this right here. We made an @student available, and so that's the name of the object that should be made available within the partial, and it will be named after the partial itself, so that this student variable right here will be this object defined right there. So I'm rendering a partial named student. Notice I don't have to put the underscore or the full html.erb, I just say what the partial's name is. And then I specify the object that I made available inside of my controller, and that will become a variable named after the partial within the partial. So now go back over here, and this should still work. The only difference is that now even within the show view, the link is there, and it just links back to itself. And then how do I make this change over in the index land? Well, I could do it in one of two ways. I could make use of this loop that's already there, where I'm looping over each one of my students. And within that loop, I could choose to render a partial named student with an object named student, because this time the object is called student, because that's what's being created for each pass of this loop. And that would work. There's nothing wrong with that. That would loop over the students, creating each student. And we can see that in action. If I go to the students here, it does the work. We see all of our students. The other thing I can do is I can remove the loop, and I can say instead render a partial, but not for a particular object, but for a collection of objects. And that collection of objects should be the students collection. And what the render command will do is it will render this partial once for every student in this collection, and it will make available to the partial a variable named after the partial for each member of the collection. So again, a little bit of magic, but I'm spelling it out. And so back over here, this is still working, this is still working, everything's still wired up. To show you the more magical way to do this is, again, the magic comes in just with, in most places, as shortcuts. Because it's a very common thing to render partials for collections, I could get away with just simply saying render students. And what Rails will do is it'll say, oh, that's a collection of student objects. I'll see if there's a student partial available and render it for the collection. So this is the short form of this. The short form of the show is just to render student. And what Rails will do here is you're trying to render a student object. I'll see if there is a student partial available and render that for this particular object. And so these are just shortened forms of these. The shortened forms only work if you followed all of the naming conventions. So if you have named your partial after the model, and you've named the variable in your the variable within the partial after the partial itself, only then will these shortened forms work. And so the long form and the short form, and again in the index, we have the long form and the short form. Whichever one you choose to use is fine. If you internalize the short form, you have to also internalize the conventions of the naming of the variables and the partial name itself. Now those conventions aren't super complicated, so you likely will be able to do that, but you also have the ability to know of this long form. With both of these in place, we could actually just see that they're both doing the same thing. And so if I go to the index page, I should see all the students listed twice. So here we are. That's from the long form. This is from the short form. And if I go to an individual student, I see the student listed twice, again, from the long form and from the short form. And the HTML generated is identical. So here's the short form HTML, the long form HTML, same in both places. Okay. Do you need to see some code? The show one. So I'm going to take those shortened forms out, again, just to remove the magic, but just know that that is part of what you can do. And again here, oops. And I can now check out what's happening in Git world. I can see that my new partial is there and the changes to the views are there. Remember, at any time, if I want to see what changes I've actually made, I can run a diff and I can see what was removed versus what was added. And in my case, I'm just going to add it all and extracted the student ERB into a partial.
Maybe I'll come up afterwards, but yeah, this now none of my students are actually short.
Okay, well let's take a moment. I'll just pause this. Okay, let's do a few more things before we go for the day. I want to show you a version of a partial that's not going to be mapping directly to a particular active record object, just as a way of sort of extracting out some functionality from a particular view. And so if we were to head over to the App Views Layouts folder, we could see the application.erb file. Remember that all of our views are just snippets of HTML. But when we view them view source wise, you can see the rest of the HTML document is there. The rest of the HTML document that we are working with in the context of working with views is coming from this application.html.erb file in your layouts folder. It's where the document is defined, where the HTML node is defined, where the head and the body are defined, and it's at this point, this yield, where the views are injected into the document. If I was to remove this yield, the rest of the application wouldn't work anymore, because that's where the individual views for every single one of our controller actions gets injected into the body. I can do things though within here, like for example, if I wanted to have a header at the top of all of my files, and within that header I wanted to have an H1 that said like student records application. By putting that into the layout file, if I now go back to my actual application, student records application, if I go to any one of the views, that student records application stays up at the top. So that's a way of sort of modifying the layout, the overall layout to your application, anything that you want to be present everywhere. The other thing could be like, say, like a footer that you wanted present on all your pages. A header can get pretty involved. It could have a menu in it that you also want involved in every single page. And I like to keep this application layout file as clean as possible. And so one use of a partial here would be to take this header and extract it out into a partial, include the partial in the application file just to keep it nice and concise, and have that header in a separate file, and then I could go about adding a menu there and everything and have sort of an isolated view for that. So how I might, yeah, go ahead.
Let's see a CSS file that was styled for your whole website.
Yeah.
Just put it there, and we'll be able to pass it.
I'll get to that in a moment, because that's once I put this header in place, we'll do a little bit of styling before we go. So I'm going to go to the App Views folder, and I'm just going to make a folder called Shared. The name of this folder doesn't matter. I've chosen to name it Shared, so it's nothing conventions-wise. And it's where I'm going to put shared partials that don't have to do with a particular model. And within it, I'm going to create a file called _header.html.erb. I'm going to open that up inside of my editor. I'll close a bunch of the other tabs that I have open. And I'm going to move these 3 lines here into that header. And as I said, like if it was just these 3 lines, I probably wouldn't be extracting this out to a partial, but we could see eventually maybe, you know, like adding to this header like a nav, and having that nav be comprised of UL with a number of LIs for each one of my menu items. Like it could get quite long, and I just don't want to cloud up my nice, simple looking application file. For now, I'm just going to leave it like this. It's the header, it's the H1. Over here, I can echo out a render statement. I'm still rendering a partial, and now I can actually path to it. I want to say render the shared header partial. And that's all I need to say, because I don't need to pass it a collection. I don't need to pass it an object. There's no variables being used within the header. I simply want to render out the partial, which is the shared header partial. And again, I don't mention the underscore. So I path view folder to partial with a slash between it, but no underscore. And if I go back to my application, it should still work in that that is added to all of the pages. And so it was a render partial shared slash header as a string, and then inside of that shared folder, that's what my header looked like. I can now commit that. Created a partial for the layout header. And then I think a nice place to close things up, we're almost out of time, is just to, Brendan asked about CSS. So what if I wanted to apply some styles to my entire application, maybe to do things like style this header or to style the application as a whole? I'm going to go to my app assets folder, and within there we have a style sheets folder. We have this application CSS file. We could put CSS right into there. However, it's the more Railsy way of doing CSS is to use SCSS, that SAS version of CSS. And if you look inside of this application file, there's actually 2 lines here that look like comments, but these are magic comments. They're actually comments that Rails reads and makes use of. And we are being asked to require in all recursive files and this file itself into sort of the global CSS pool that makes up our application. What that means is that I can add files, any file I want, to this folder here. I'm going to create one called main.scss. When we name something SCSS, it's going to be run through the SCSS preprocessor by way of what Rails calls the asset pipeline before it actually gets sent out to the end user. And so we can write Sass in here, but the end user gets sent the precompiled CSS. And now I can style up my document a little bit, and I have a cheat sheet for some of the styling that I'm going to apply. So here's what my document looks like. I've got a body in it. Within the body, I've got this header, which is just a header with an H1 inside of it. And then I yield to each one of my views within there. I can write Sass here, but I can also write just plain old CSS. So I'm going to start with applying to the body some CSS. And I'll just do some very generic styling here. I'm going to put a 1 pixel gray border around my body. I'm going to sort of tone down the harshness of having just straight up black for my text color by just setting the text color to 111. I'm going to apply a font family with fallbacks. This is my favorite font family. Verdana, Geneva, Deja Vu, Sans. And if you don't get all this right now, you can definitely just watch this and grab it from the repo. And I have a fallback. These are all sans serif fonts, so I have a fallback just to the generic sans serif of the browser. I'm going to apply a margin of 2 EMs, top and bottom, an auto on either side, some padding, and an explicit width. So the explicit width will now be auto-centered because the left and right margins are auto. There'll be padding inside the border, a margin outside the border. I'm now sitting at a sans serif font. The fallbacks I've chosen should cover off all operating systems. So this should be a nice sans serif for Windows, a nice sans serif for Macs, and a nice sans serif for Linux-based PCs. And as I said, I've sort of unharshed just the solid black color. That'll get me to something that looks like this. And then usually what I do is I typically apply some styling to at least the first few levels of headers that I'm going to make use of. I usually give them a font family as well. And again, I like to have fallbacks that cover off all the major operating systems, Bitstream, Charter, and these are all serif fonts. So far, plain old CSS. Header, style that H1 so that the H1 in the header only is italic with a bit of an extra margin to the bottom of it. And that should be enough to show a little bit of styling now. So I've got, these are applied to everything within the body, so all of my views are going to have some of this stuff cascading down to them. The body itself will be have a border. This is what the application now looks like. So you've got the serif fonts with an italicized one for the header. You got sans serif fonts for the rest of the application. Go back, there's my various students. I'm pretty particular about CSS. Like you may not have noticed, but like all of my CSS properties are in alphabetical order. I do that because CSS gets out of hand so easily. And so anything I can do to make my CSS easier to read and understand, even this, like putting all of the multiple targets on separate lines, anything I can do to make my CSS more readable. Because for me, my CSS always gets unreadable eventually, just because I usually take a fairly ad hoc approach to writing CSS. I just add it as I need it. And so I need little things to keep me in check. And so doing things like alphabetizing my properties or spacing out to multiple lines my various matches, those can be helpful. And I think that's where we're going to end things for today. I can add and commit, added some styling to a new main.scss file. And we are now done for the day.